This is Colm's third visit to UAlbany. His previous visit in April of 2016 was a disaster. The 2015 hit movie Brooklyn, based on his 2009 novel, had recently been in theaters. In addition to a huge general audience, we were blessed with an unmanageably large turnout from Irish cultural organizations. There was at least one troupe of Irish step dancers, 20 or more young girls who came with their teacher. We made the mistake, and Suzanne Lance, who was associate director at the time, is here in the audience, so she probably remembers all of this. We made the mistake of scheduling the afternoon event in the recital hall of the Performing Arts Center, which has a capacity of 228. We had to turn many people away, and we were met with great fury. I hope no one takes offense to my saying this. There is no fury like Irish fury. The angry phone calls kept coming for weeks. People told us they would never attend another Writers Institute event or another basketball game again. UAlbany alumni told us they would never make a donation and they'd renounce their university degrees. Some demanded that we pay their parking tickets because they had parked in random and unauthorized parking spots across the campus. Thankfully, the evening event that night was here in Page Hall, a much larger space. In truth, both events were a great triumph and an ongoing traumatic experience, much like the life of Thomas Mann, I think. To properly introduce Colm Toibín, I will pass this mic to Lynne Tillman. Fiction writer and cultural critic Lynne Tillman is a professor and writer in residence here at UAlbany. She's a two-time finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for her 1998 novel, No Lease on Life, and for her 2014 essay collection, What Would Lynne Tillman Do? Her forthcoming nonfiction book, due out in August, is Mother Care, about the challenges of caring for her elderly mother and navigating the American health system. In his official capacity as a personal friend, Colm Toibín wrote the introduction to What Would Lynne Tillman Do?, a piece that was also published in The New Yorker. In describing Lynne, he says, more than anything, she's a rich noticer of strange things and a good maker of sentences and phrases. He also says her response to books is daring, sharp. She allows for mystery, beauty, strangeness, but she also allows for complexity, coolness, distance. These two authors are already very much in dialogue. What a privilege it is to listen in. Please welcome Lynne Tillman.
How to describe a miraculous writer and friend like Colm Toibín? I know he's called an Irish writer, and he is. He was born in 1955 in Enniscorthy in Wexford, Ireland. And certainly his home country is a subject for him. His first novel, The South, saw an Irishman living in Spain. I met Colm when The South was published in the UK. One of mine was published, too, from the same press, and we became friends during an arduous 6-day tour around England together in a tiny car. Colm, were he telling you about this, would offer a longer and different story, but I'll keep it short. It's when we became friends, 1990, and I love him and everything he does more and more with time passing. Colm Toibín is one of our time's best international writers. His interests are broad, his knowledge, to me and others, literally dumbfounding. His novels, essays, and stories cover the world. An essay on Picasso, so many reviews of books, a book on important gay male writers, Love in a Dark Time, Gay Lives from Wilde to Almodovar. A book of stories called Mothers and Sons, and if that's not international, I don't know what is. And then there's Testament, a play and book imagining Jesus' mother, Mary. He's curated art exhibitions. He's written a book on Lady Gregory called Lady Gregory's Toothbrush. He's written a critical study of Elizabeth Bishop. The list can go on and on. And I'm not mentioning his numerous awards, titles, and recognitions, because frankly, it would deflate every writer in the room. Tonight, Colm will read from The Magician, his historical, fictional, biographical novel based on the life and writing of the great German writer, Thomas Mann. Historical fiction, as compared with history, allows a brilliant writer, such as Colm, to build a character, Mann, in his historical moment, so that what Mann writes can be understood in the context in which he lived, its politics, art, its vicissitudes, its glories. It can allow us readers to comprehend the humanity or lack of it in a famous lived life. It can also, as Colm does in The Magician, show how complex are the choices facing a public figure like Mann, and the private man also, and his lack of choices. Toibín's descriptions and understanding of Mann's exceptional wife and their unusual children locate an enigmatic writer in daily life and in family problems. And most urgent and important to Toibín's execution of The Magician, Mann lived in and through the worst, most vicious period in the West in the 20th century, the rise of Hitler and Nazism and World War II. This is a major factor in Mann's life and beautifully and thoroughly rendered in the novel. And this is all to come alive, and does come alive, in Colm Toibín's exceptional novel, The Magician. So please welcome the outgoing Chancellor of Liverpool University and recently named Laureate of Irish Fiction in Ireland. Colm.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you very much. Thomas Mann was born in Lübeck in 1875. Lübeck is in the north of Germany. The nearest big city would be Hamburg. His family were traders. They went back several generations in building a big warehousing and shipping farm. And his father was a senator. He was an important. He would have been noticed on the street, Lübeck being a small city, as one of the family, who perhaps the second son, who may have been the one to take over the farm. Perhaps the strangeness entered into the spirit of the family, his father's marriage. Actually went to the house where his mother was born, Thomas Mann's mother was born, in Brazil, outside a place called Paraty, which is an inlet in between Rio and Sao Paulo. And the house is right on the water. And I was with a friend from Australia who explained, because he had a house on the water in Tasmania, that at night, if it's an inlet where the water is calm, in the southern hemisphere, the stars shine low and they shine bright. And if you're upstairs in a house like that, you would actually get what's even stronger than sunlight sometimes, with the stars reflecting against the water into the building. And he said that this is what Thomas Mann's childhood, his mother's childhood would have been. That extraordinary business of the stars and the calm water. And of course, the exotic, what would be later when she came to Germany, would be seen as the exotic nature of Brazil. She was brought as a girl, his mother, to Lübeck. There was a great trade between Lübeck and Brazil, because Lübeck is the place where marzipan is made in Germany, and they need all the sugar they can get. And the ships would come between Brazil and Lübeck. And so Thomas Mann's mother's father was German, but his grandmother was actually Brazilian, meaning that she was of mixed race. And so his Thomas Mann's father's marriage would have been seen. He married outside the commercial sector of Lübeck, but also married someone essentially of a different race. And Thomas Mann always said that himself and his brother Heinrich, that they became writers because they had this mixture in them of father and mother, north and south, of hard commercial instincts and something much different. I just want to read first from it's the opening of the book, and Thomas Mann and his brother Heinrich are boys. Their two sisters are there. And their mother is called Julia, and she is really telling them about her life and where she's from. I mean, I did think, seeing that stars and that house in Brazil, what it might have been like for somebody who was brought up there to come to Northern Europe with the overcast sky and the cold. In the evenings, if the senator were at a meeting, or in the time when Thomas and Heinrich, having done their violin practice and eaten their supper, were in their nightclothes, their mother would tell them about the country of her birth, Brazil. A place so vast, she said, that no one knew how many people were there, or what they were like, or what languages they spoke. A country many, many times the size of Germany, where there was no winter, and never any frost or real cold, and where one river, the Amazon, was more than 10 times longer than the Rhine, and 10 times as wide, with many smaller rivers flowing into it that reached back deep into the forest, with trees higher than trees anywhere else in the world, with people whom no one had ever seen or would see, since they knew the forest as no one else did, and they could hide if an intruder or an outsider came. Tell us about the stars, Heinrich would say. Our house in Paraty was on the water, his mother would reply. It was almost part of the water, like a boat. And when night came and we could see the stars, they were bright and low in the sky. Here in the north, the stars are high and distant. In Brazil, they are visible like the sun during the day. They are small suns themselves, glittering and close to us, especially those of us who live near water. My mother said that sometimes you could read a book in the upstairs rooms at night because the light from the stars against the water was so clear. And you could not sleep unless you fastened the shutters to keep the brightness out. When I was a girl, the same age as your sisters, I really believed that all the world was like that. The shock on my first night in Lübeck was that I could not see the stars. They were covered over by clouds. Tell us about the ship. You must go to sleep. No, just tell us the story of all the sugar. Tommy, you know the story of the sugar. You know, just a small part, again. Well, all the marzipan that is made in Lübeck uses sugar that comes from Brazil. Just as Lübeck is famous for marzipan, Brazil is famous for sugar. So when the good people of Lübeck and their children eat their marzipan on Christmas Eve, little do they know that they're eating a part of Brazil. They're eating sugar that came across the sea just for them. Why don't we make our own sugar? You must ask your father that. When Thomas Mann was in his early teens, this world collapsed. His father died, and his brother Heinrich had no interest in commercial life, and his father took the view that the best thing, in his will, that the best thing would be if the family firm was completely wound up. And so it was, with a group of people put almost in charge of the family to sort of supervise Julia in the bringing up of her children. Very quickly, she moved from Lübeck to Munich, which might not seem now like such a big move, but then, I mean, we're talking, I suppose, about 1890. Germany was unified in 1871, but this move would have been from a Protestant commercial city in the north to Munich in Bavaria, which was not only a sort of Catholic city as a capital of Bavaria, but also a cosmopolitan city as a sort of crossroads city with a Jewish population, with a very seriously advanced cultural life. And she moved there, and the move was an important one because in Lübeck she had been an important figure because she was married to the senator. But in Munich she was nobody. And for Thomas Mann, that idea that when he went to live there, still in his teens, nobody knew him on the street. He could walk anywhere and people had no idea who he was. He was invisible, he was a ghost, he had no friends, but he wasn't known, he wasn't seen. Whereas all his childhood, every time he stepped onto the street in Lübeck, he would have been known and seen. And almost that gap between the two cities gave him his first inspiration, which was to write a novel called Buddenbrooks, which he finished at the age of 25 in 1900, which was a novel which not only reconstructed the Mann family in his parents' generation, but went back 3 more generations and became a sort of a big blockbuster 19th century novel about the development and the decline of a commercial family in Northern Europe at the end of the 19th century. That in other words, by losing it, he felt the need to reconstruct it, that the impulse came not only from a sort of literary source, but from a deeply personal and pressing source. This, in a way, is not some of this book. Sometimes if you're writing a book and you think this book is, the great thing about this book is there's nothing about Ireland. I don't have to put in all my aunts and uncles, or I don't have to put in Enniscorthy, and I don't have to mention Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael or the Civil War or Michael Collins or De Valera or Parnell. I don't have to worry about any of those things at all, that I'm elsewhere. But you're never elsewhere. No matter what you do, the old things come back after you. So not only the death of the father in childhood and all that stuff that I've written about before, but the big shock of coming up from provincial Ireland to Dublin and of realising that everyone in Dublin was smarter than I was. They just knew more. They laughed at things that I didn't realise yet were funny. I couldn't get the joke. And there's nothing worse than being in a company of a friend who's brought you back to her house to meet her family, to find they're all laughing at you because you're from the country. And I thought Enniscorthy was a civilised, sort of normal place. I suppose so it is, but it's a small town in the southeast of Ireland. So the coming to Dublin and finding this strange smartness that I could never quite catch up. And I spent my life since then in various places, including America, trying to catch up, trying just to see if people wouldn't find me out as being basically from a small town, just trying to work out what's going on here because you're all somehow ahead of me. You get the joke. I just don't, So this is Thomas Mann. He's published his novel Buddenbrooks, and he's in Munich. And if you go to Lübeck now and you go into the art museum, you find that there's a painting there of a number, which was painted at the end of the 19th century. And it's a number of children all dressed up as clowns, 4 boys and a girl. And that was a portrait done of a famous family in Munich, their children. They were called the Pringsheims. Thomas Mann in Lübeck, never having been in Munich, this was reprinted in a magazine. He cut out the reproduction and he had it on the wall of his bedroom like people would a rock star or a soccer star. He had this on his wall. Later on, I'm talking 10 years later, in Munich, he saw this family and realised who they were, that they were the Pringsheims. They were now adults. They were in their 20s. One of them was studying conducting with Gustav Mahler in Vienna. Now, if you're a boy from Lübeck, the idea of someone studying conducting with Gustav Mahler in Vienna is very posh. And he began to watch them at concerts. And they, in turn, began to watch him. Because even though he was provincial from Lübeck, he was a famous young writer. And that mattered to the Pringsheims. That they were assimilated Jews. They were tremendously rich. The father was a professor of mathematics as well as looking after his money, and they were bohemian. They had a beautiful house in the middle of Munich. They gave many great parties, and they had one beautiful daughter called Katja, who was one of the first women to study science in a German university. Her grandmother was the most advanced feminist in Germany, and so these were very interesting people. And finally, Thomas Mann. He's not from Enniscorthy, but he's from Lübeck. But nonetheless, he gets an invitation, finally, to a party in their house. And so these are the Pringsheims, and Thomas Mann has come to a party in their house. He's in his late 20s, and Katja, the girl of the house, is about 21. And he's been watching her already, and he's going to marry her in the future. He will have 6 children with her. And this is how they meet. There were, he guessed, more than 100 people at the Pringsheim supper, the first one he attended, with tables spread over several of the reception rooms. Most of these rooms had carved ceilings and inlaid paintings and murals. No surface was undecorated. He arrived, accompanied by the nervous young poet and the poet's aunt, the painter, who wore many glittering jewels around her neck and in her hair. The Pringsheim boys, especially Klaus and Peter, are a lesson to the youth of Munich, the aunt said. They are refined and civilized. They've already achieved such a great deal. Thomas wanted to ask her what precisely they had achieved. But as soon as they had handed over their coats, she moved away from them, leaving the two young men to linger in the shadows, watching the scene. A few times he caught Katia Pringsheim's eye, and while she seemed amused at his presence, she did not acknowledge him directly. Once supper was over, he asked his friend to introduce him to Katia and Klaus, who's her twin brother, who were standing in the doorway having an intense conversation. He could see Katia smiling as she interrupted her brother, putting her finger to his lips to stop him speaking. Although they must have been conscious that Thomas and the poet were approaching, they did not turn. The poet reached out and touched Klaus's shoulder. As Klaus looked at him, Thomas saw how beautiful he was. He almost understood why Klaus did not frequent the cafes. He would have been singled out and stared at. His politeness, the understatement in his tone, the neatness of his dress would have stood apart from the abrasiveness and the shabbiness then in vogue. Thomas, aware that Katia was watching him as he took in her brother, directed his full attention at her. Her eyes were the same deep dark colour as her brother's. Her skin was even softer. Her gaze was unembarrassed. Your book is much admired in this house, Klaus said. In fact, we all fell out because one of us hid the second volume. Katia stretched lazily. He could see the boyish strength in her body. I will not mention the culprit, Klaus went on. My brother is tedious, Katia said. We call you Hanno, Klaus said. Hanno is the protagonist, the child protagonist of the novel Buddenbrooks that Thomas Mann had written. We call you Hanno, Katia said. We call you Hanno, Klaus said. Some of us do, Katia said. We all do, even my mother, who hasn't finished the book. Yeah, she has finished it. As of 2 p.m. today, she had not finished it. I told her the ending, Katia said. My sister spoils things for people. She told me the end of Die Walküre. My father had already told us, and I was worried that he'd find out you hadn't been listening. Our brother Heinz told us the end of the Bible, Klaus said, and it ruined everything. That was in fact Peter, Katia said. He's horrible. Our father had to ban him from gatherings. My sister spends her life listening to our father, Klaus said. She actually studies with him. Thomas looked from one to the other. Their conversation, he sensed, was their underhand way of laughing at him, or at least excluding him and his companion. He knew that on arriving home he would remember every word they had said. When he had cut out the portraits of the young Pringsheims from that magazine, this was what he had imagined. A world filled with elegant people and rich interiors, with conversations going on that were both clever and oddly inconsequential. He did not mind that the decor was perhaps too rich, and that some of the people were too effusive. He minded nothing, as long as these two young people continued to allow him to listen to them and watch them. Oh no, Katia said, and my mother is being held in a vice-like grip by that woman whose husband plays the viola. Why was she invited, Klaus asked. Because you or my father or Mahler or someone admires how her husband plays the viola. My father knows nothing about the viola. My grandmother thinks there should be a ban on any woman marrying, Katia said. Imagine how different these rooms would be if people had only listened to her. My grandmother is Hedwig Dom, Klaus said to Thomas as though he were confiding in him. She's very advanced. As they left the house, the young poet told Thomas that he had asked his aunt if the Pringsheims were Jewish. What did she say? Thomas asked. They used to be, on both sides, but not anymore. They are Protestants now, even though they seem very Jewish. Jewish in a grand way. They converted. My aunt said that they assimilated. So he marries her, and they have 6 children. And she becomes even more clever and in a way more, I suppose, more, once she has her first child, Katia really changes and becomes responsible and serious. And she watches him very carefully. In her old age, in her 90s, she dictated her memoirs, a book called Unwritten Memories. And in that book she describes, for example, being in Venice with her husband in 1911. And Tommy, as she calls him, looking at a boy on the beach. as in his book Death in Venice. And she doesn't seem shocked by this or surprised by it or thinking it was wrong. She just merely wants to say that he didn't follow the boy in the streets as it happens in the novella. But the boy was there, the boy existed. And she seems an extremely tolerant and clever person, and she manipulated or she navigated the world they lived in with really great care, because it took great care. Because when the First World War broke out, Thomas Mann, who up to then had been in most ways, apolitical, became militaristic, Prussian, and bloodthirsty. And it's an extraordinary sight to see this normal man. And this happened in so many countries in 1914. It happened in England in 1914, that people became suddenly vastly, massively patriotic and wanted to, go on the battlefields themselves, or at least send other people there. And Thomas Mann did not fight in the First World War, but by God did he want others to fight. And he wrote a dreadful book called Reflections of a Non-Political Man, where he tried to outline his relationship to the German state or to the German nation, or using these words, nation, these dangerous words, and talking about German culture and giving that word culture a special meaning. And he wrote that book, which he published in 1918. Luckily, the war was just ending. Luckily, no one noticed the book. But it's in print. If you want to read a dreadful book, please apply to that book. And what's marvellous is that he changed, in that he was a monarchist. Even in 1918, he was still a monarchist. He favoured the Kaiser, and he changed, and very quickly, and he became a Democrat. He even became a sort of socialist. But he certainly, as Hitler rose, he became very frightened at the idea, and then he became, in the 30s, an implacable enemy of Hitler. And in the 1940s, he continued writing and publishing. He won the Nobel Prize in 1929. He was in exile from 1933 onwards, first in Switzerland and then in France, and then he came to America. His heroic period politically is in the Second World War in the United States, where, with the full blessing of President Roosevelt, who really trusted him, he began to speak all over America in public, which, as a German novelist, you can just imagine the sort of strangeness of this. There was no equivalent Italian doing this. There was no Japanese novelist doing this. Thomas Mann toured America. His speech was generally the same. It was called The Coming Victory of Democracy. And in this faltering English, he would get as many as 5,000 people to attend these events. In places such as Oklahoma or Iowa, Ohio, Chicago, he would tour, just talking about the idea of liberty. Liberty as an ideal, and democracy as something fundamental. So the war was not being fought to defeat Hitler. It was being fought for something that America shared with the Germany of the future that he himself represented. And he spoke eloquently, and he spoke from the heart. It mattered to him then. And what he said made a difference. And it isn't as though he gave up his work as an artist, because in these same years, having built a beautiful house in Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles, he was writing his novel, Dr. Faustus. So just the last thing I'm going to read is he became concerned about what he shared with Hitler. He knew what the differences were, and obviously they were immense. But what did he share with Hitler? Well, he had lived in Munich in the same years as Hitler had lived in Munich. And they loved the same music. The same Wagner that he loved was not a different Wagner that Hitler was listening to. And he had to tease out these matters over what culture had produced him and produced Hitler. And what did it mean? The great German 19th century tradition of say, Wagner's operas, of Beethoven's symphonies, that all this stirring of the spirit with vast orchestral music, these slow movements bringing the melancholy into the mood, and then these vast uprisings of emotion with the vast symphony orchestra. This had lifted the German spirit, it had exalted it, but also in bringing the emotion up, the emotion itself had become both exalted and poisonous. And so that preyed on his mind what culture meant in a place where culture had led to the concentration camps. And when he built the house in Pacific Palisades, he wanted to do something to mark the occasion. And this was a time when putting on Wagner would have been, even though he loved the music, would have brought with it too much baggage. But one thing Germany still had, besides its lyric poetry, for example, that was pure, was its chamber music, was the quartet and the trios that Beethoven had written, Haydn had written, Mozart had written. And his son Michael, Thomas Mann's youngest child, was a viola player. And he worked with the string quartet, and he was living in California. And the quartet were young and they were ready for anything. And Thomas Mann asked him, would your quartet come to the house, and we'll invite some people and play Beethoven Opus 132, which of the late quartets written when Beethoven was deaf, written at the very end of his life, written after the Ninth Symphony. These are extraordinary, I suppose. It isn't merely that the music is beautiful, it is that formally these are really adventurous. It sounds like modern music sometimes. And Opus 132 of all of them is the one that I suppose stands out because it has in the middle this slow movement, which is a prayer of thanksgiving, which is really, really uplifting. And at the same time, I suppose, dark and melancholy as well, but it's pure. In other words, it isn't as though it could stir a crowd. It could stir a single soul. And Thomas Mann thought this would be a fitting thing to have played in his house. He had got all his family out of Europe, his 6 children, his wife, his brother, his sister-in-law. And so this is 1942, and this is the music. It was hard not to look at the players, not to study. Oh, sorry, I'm going to just start a paragraph earlier. When the music began, Thomas was struck by its daring, the quiet release of a sort of anguish, followed by a tone that suggested struggle, with hints that the struggle brought both pain and joy, immense joy. He knew, stop thinking, give up trying to find simple meaning in the music, but instead let it enter his spirit, listen to it as though he might never get another chance. It was hard not to look at the players, however, not to study their seriousness and concentration. Thomas watched them taking their cues from the lead violinist. The lead violinist and Michael on the viola seemed to spar, taking energy from each other. The music edged towards resolution and held back for a moment before it soared. He glanced over at Katia, whose wife, who smiled at him. This was the world of her parents, who had hosted many such chamber concerts in their house in Munich. Out of this old world from which they had been forced to flee, Michael, their son, had emerged as the one with musical talent. Thomas watched him playing with slow care, showing no emotion, as handsome and self-possessed. He let the viola's dark sound hit against the sweeter sound of the 2 violins. As the music continued, the lead violinist and the cellist shed some of their Americanness. The rangy, friendly, masculine openness apparent earlier was replaced, he saw, by vulnerability, sensitivity, until they could have been Germans or Hungarians from decades before. Maybe he thought it was merely something he imagined, something caused by the force of the 4 instruments playing together, as they found moments of pure connection with one another and then went silent or played solo. But Thomas could entertain the idea that ghosts from an earlier time, ghosts who had once walked the streets of Europe, of the European cities, carrying instruments, ghosts on their way to rehearsal, were present here in this new house overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Southern California. Thank you very much.
It was a beautiful reading. Who gave you the $20?
Bookmark. With inflation now, it's going to be soon. It's going to be it's just $20. It's going to be just
I
for
thought
bookmarks.
maybe you were trying to bribe me. I was thinking about, as you were reading, about the choices you made in terms of what you read and why you read those, but also the way that you are able to kind of annotate his life in order to be able to make those readings so beautifully.
I mean, I think the houses for me were a big emotional anchor. that I came to Los Angeles first in 2005. So I must have known that I was going to be writing this book, because the one thing I wanted to see was the inside of Thomas Mann's house in Pacific Palisades. And the woman who owned it, who had bought it from the Manns, in other words, she was in her 80s, she'd bought it 50 years earlier, she got fed up with TV crews and, stray, glittery fellows arriving, and she just said no to everyone at that point. But for some reason, she relented that week and said I could come. And seeing, first of all, the opulence of the house, meaning that the Manns always had money. His books sold incredibly well in America. If you were a certain sort of household in America, you had Thomas Mann's novels in hardback, which the Knopfs published, and published really well, and he made a lot of money from them. And so he got this. It was a German Jewish architect living in America who'd really become American and understood the planning laws. And what's interesting about the house is that even though he is now in his, he's in his 60s, he's 65, 66 when he's planning the house, that he still has to create bedrooms for all his children, because only one of them has really settled. Maybe two, but four of them have not, meaning that they are still in their 40s. Because of the war and the rise of Hitler, they have not been able to find homes. So he has to make sort of bedrooms and places for them. But that's the first thing. The second thing is it had a view both of the Santa Catalina Island, the Pacific Ocean, and the Sierra on the other side. Beautiful gardens, a full-time gardener, but also the room where that music is being played. I could stand in that room. And what's fascinating is that, of course, the house is pure Californian. It's all, bringing in the light, guarding the light, holding the light, making everything white and pure with the light. But that his study is to the side. And I got in also to the study he had in Princeton in the house. The house is now owned by the Catholic Church. So the lovely priest, Irish origin, Philadelphia accent, brought me in and showed me. I was fascinated by because it was now the priest study. The amount of his liquor tray seemed to be very rich indeed. I should have been minding my own business, but this was Thomas Mann's study, very like the other study, meaning shadowy space, away from the domestic space. He brought his, strange ideas. He brought his, even though he was fleeing from Hitler, he brought his desk from Munich. He had it shipped over. And he brought his collection of Goethe's books. So it was a strange bourgeois way of fleeing from Hitler. He had candelabra from the house in Lübeck with him, and just getting into that house and just seeing, he had his own staircase, which is all we've all wanted in our lives, really, is to have our own staircase in the house, even as children, where you could go up the stairs without anyone knowing where you'd gone upstairs. He had his own staircase from his own, just outside his study, up to his own bedroom. And
so no one knew when he was in or out?
Well, he wanted that idea that his life as a writer was to be separate, and his room had much less light in it, and it could have been a room in Germany, and he was recreating space so that he could work. So just being in that house and the house in Princeton just gave me a lot of energy that I could work from within those spaces, just so I could see him in those spaces.
Was it Princeton who brought him over? Is that how he got out of Germany?
He was brought over first to get an honorary doctorate at Harvard, which himself and Einstein got. And Einstein was delighted that, he said, the applause for you was much bigger than the applause for me. And said, that's as it should be. If the world was not, the world would be wrong. He couldn't understand what Einstein meant by that. And he became, he was effectively taken up by a woman called Agnes Mayer, who is the mother of Katharine Graham, whose husband Eugene owned the Washington Post. And she was a tremendous force of nature. Her parents were German, and she wanted to write a book about him, and she realized his greatness, and she thought Roosevelt would like him. And she really told Roosevelt who he should like. You know, she was that sort of person. Roosevelt said in the novel, says about her, you know, she calls once a day, and I take a call once a week. And he said, you know, like Roosevelt was trying to just, she's an opera singer, was Roosevelt's description. And, but she organized everything for him. I mean, she set up the job at Princeton, and she set up the relationship with the White House. She set up all the visas, because visas were, no matter who you were becoming really difficult to get. So she organized a lot of things for him in America. And so, yeah, he came to Princeton first. And then, strangely, all the German exiles who were writers or composers, architects, they all loved Los Angeles. It wasn't just the weather or things were cheap. It was that Los Angeles was made up of foreigners. In places like Princeton, you stood out with a German accent. As 38 went into 39, having a German accent was not helpful in the butcher shop or in the, you know, and dealing with people on the street. But in Los Angeles, no one minded that as much, because of course there was a big Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and Mexican population. They just didn't feel they stood out as much. And so Heinrich Mann, Schoenberg, I mean, so many of the who you call
the architects.
Yeah, Alma Mahler, Gustav Mahler's widow, the architects, they all centered around a very small space in Los Angeles. And of course, I was going to say being Irish. They weren't Irish, of course. I just made a mistake being Irish. But I mean, being an exiled community in a small place, they had vicious feuds and rows all the time. It wasn't as though they gathered together for parties and sang songs. They gathered together for faction fights, being Irish. I mean, not being Irish. And they behaved like Irish people, actually. And so that was a very dramatic time for them.
Yeah. I asked you before why you wrote a book on Thomas Mann, why your project, and you said because you loved him.
Well, I read those books. I think for all of us, there are books we read when we're 19 or 20, that we find ourselves, or a friend gives them to us, and they take over our lives for a short period. And it seems to me that those books really matter to you all your life. And it's lovely when you read them first. You don't know this is going to happen to you. And so I certainly read Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, then Magic Mountain, Death in Venice, Dr. Faustus, probably over 2 or 3 years, in my late teens, early 20s. And I really loved the books. And I thought that writers wrote out of a sense of certainty, from talent, from entitlement, from a feeling of power, and that a book got written, was published, was translated, and the writer wrote more books, and life went on. It didn't strike me then how much uncertainty, how much unease, how many unresolved things a writer works with. I thought it was all resolution. I didn't realize that almost none of it is. That the energy almost comes from lack of resolution. And the big change was that Thomas Mann, in his will, he has that his diaries should be published 35 years. But then he crosses that out and puts 25. And that he knew that diaries were dynamite, because the diaries described his secret erotic life, which was effectively homosexual, and his political uncertainty, and his domestic uncertainty, and his general unease in the world. He's need to take a sleeping pill at night. He's never certain about anything. And you realize that the books really had been nourished by this vast uncertainty. And I was fascinated by the distance between the photographs you see of him, the way he presented himself to the world as this buttoned-up figure filled with certainties, and how much that his private world was really filled with demons, filled with loss, and filled with erotic uncertainty, and filled with political uncertainty. And I realized, of course, that the novel itself is nourished by the distance, by the dramatic distance often between what somebody thinks and what someone says. And that almost uniquely in art forms, the novel is poised to dramatize that distance between private thought, interior self, intimacy, and the public presentation of that. which often there's a big gap between those two things. And with this figure, I felt I could really work with that, and that I sort of knew something about it, and it was something I could bring to this story.
You mentioned his children. You mentioned his children before. I mean, just briefly, that they had 6 children. But those 6 children were exceptional, and there were 2 of them, Klaus and Erika, who were almost immediately from when they were teenagers, public figures.
Yeah, I mean, I kneel down every night and I pray and I ask God, I'll promise to be a good girl if God will make me write a novel with no more 6 children in the book, because it's really technically trying to keep all of these children in the air without losing sight of where's Monica, or who is Monica? And the reader's going to see Michael, which is, look, it's really hard. And
could you have ignored them?
No. He had 6, and Thomas Mann had 6 children. You have to put 6 children. You can't mess with that sort of thing. And but 2 of them came into their own in the very years, after the First World War, when people started to be able to do what they liked, and they became, Erika Mann and Klaus Mann became poster children in the New Germany. They did what they wanted, they said what they wanted, they slept with whoever they wanted, they wore what they liked, and they wrote what they liked. And they became really famous, were photographed, and Erika would have Erika was bisexual, Klaus was gay, and they flaunted that. And they would come home regularly looking for money to their poor father, who was closeted gay, who was in his study working, who was wearing a 4-piece suit, who was just, and these mad children would then want to go to Persia, I mean, really, and go to New York and tour the world and write another book. And they were having love affairs, and then they would write a play about the love affairs. Then they would act in the theatre as themselves, and crowds would come to see them. They were called the Mann twins, even though they weren't twins. And when the CIA got on their case, which they certainly, and the FBI got a file on them saying they were committing incest. And I was like, where did this come from? And they never, they didn't commit incest. But in other words, those 2 children then, of course, you felt that they could have become anything in Germany. But of course, they were destroyed by Hitler. And there's a wonderful moment, there really is a wonderful moment, you couldn't make this up, I didn't make this up, where, the problem after 1933 was these mans were effectively stateless. They couldn't renew their passports. So Thomas Mann eventually got Czech citizenship before he got American citizenship. He came to America with his Czech passport. And but Erika's passport was running out earlier than the rest of them. And she was really going to become stateless. And that meant she could be deported. And certainly Nazis were waiting for her. And so she was at a party in Amsterdam. She was often at a party in Amsterdam. And this is about 1935. And she meets this really lovely Englishman. And she realizes that he's gay, because her brother Klaus is gay, and she finds he's gay. And she says to him, look, there's something I wanted to ask you. Would you marry me? And Christopher Isherwood says, no, my mother wouldn't like that, or something. He didn't want to marry her. And he said, but I have a friend, and I think he would marry you. So they sent a telegram to the friend, and they got a reply from W.H. Auden, who was the friend, the telegram simply said, delighted. And so Erika put on her best suit and tie, got her hair cut short, and went to England and actually married Auden. And as a result, she had a British passport for the Second World War and could work for the BBC. And at the Nuremberg trials, she was the only journalist let down into the cells of the condemned Nazis because she was Thomas Mann's daughter. And so, she had a particular sort of war because she got a...
Did she report on the way in which she talked with those?
Oh, she reported on the trial in the cell. She did, yeah.
What is that in?
It's in
some collection of her stuff. Yeah.
But they talked to her because she was the daughter of Thomas Mann.
She was let into the cells because of that.
Because of that.
Yes.
Wow.
And one of them said to one of the guards when she left was, "We handled that Thomas Mann thing really badly," as though somehow they could have handled it well. You know, but I mean, the children were fascinating, including the second youngest, Elizabeth. And she said the cleverest thing of all, really. She said, after 30, after 30, no one has the right to blame their parents for anything. Oh. Which, of course, was an enormous relief to Thomas Mann, because they all blamed him all the time for everything. And she married a man older than her father. But you know, after the war, it wasn't as though anyone welcomed the Manns back into Germany. The Germans felt like victims when it came to 1945. Strangely, you know, they felt that they had been bombed, their cities had been destroyed. They forgot what they had done earlier, and they didn't want exiles coming back in triumph, saying, "We told you so." So there was no room for the children in the new Germany. None of them went back to live there, except Golo, the son, who became an historian. But Klaus committed suicide, and so did Michael, after the war. And so it is the story of these very privileged people having their lives destroyed. You know, while all around, of course, there was suffering and destruction of a much, you know, more extreme sort.
It's kind of fascinating that Mann was himself secretive, and his children, Erica and Klaus, were so openly whatever they were, gay or bi or. But did you have a sense of how he treated that, or did he just? He didn't stop them from doing things that he would have stopped himself doing.
Yeah. After the First World War in Germany, no one stopped anybody doing anything. In other words, there were so many orders had been given by the Prussians to everybody that people just wanted no more orders. So he hadn't a hope of ordering them to do anything. By the time they were 14 or 15, they were ordering him. And so, you know, it was a lovely turnaround. I mean, for a novelist, it's good because I can have them speaking and shouting and having opinions from very early on in their lives and being shocking. And he's watching all this with wonder. You know, he's not. He's a very modern man, and you know, in many ways, and he's imagined things. But it's not as though there's no Oedipal, there's no generational conflict. It's a more complicated story than that.
Well, that is fascinating. I'm wondering about the historical novel, the biography, the fiction, and all of this, and. I'm wondering why you're so drawn to it. I mean, there was The Master, your Henry James book, and like this one, although very different, rendered with such deftness, but dealing with so many quote-unquote facts, where they were, who they knew, and so on. What about that is magnetic for you, let's say?
Well, it starts badly, really, where I'm doing work on Henry James and I'm building myself up to writing this novel, and you know, it's going to take me a long time. I better be sure that I really need to do this. And one day I'm reading a letter that Henry James wrote, and this woman, a friend of his who was a novelist, had decided to write an historical novel. You know, I don't know, set in Tudor.
Constance?
No, this is before that. And it's set in some sort of Tudor period or something. And James just writes back to her to say that he associates the historical novel with, this is a lovely Jamesian phrase, a fatal cheapness. A fatal cheapness. And it sort of follows me around all day. It's like sort of, someone, it's like a debt collector, coming to the door regularly. A fatal cheapness. And in other words, I think there is a fatal cheapness attached to the form of pretending you can imagine what this famous writer was saying, doing, thinking, and feeling. And, there's a great deal to go on in the sense we have his diaries and we have his letters. But at the same time, trying to say that you know the real figure or that somehow you have some deeper insight that a biographer would. I think you just want to be careful. I'm fascinated by the marriage. I'm fascinated by the gap between, as I said, the public figure, the private man, and I started to write it down, but I wouldn't make any claims for it. And also, I'm not going to do it again. I mean, I'm really not going to. No,
really?
I'm too old, and I've also got loads of stuff from Enniscorthy that I've never told anyone yet. And, so I'm back home, and I'm staying home for the foreseeable future. I'm not going. I mean, part of the problem is that I had written a novel called The Blackwater Lightship, which is set over 7 days with 6 characters in a rainy Irish seaside place where there's no glamour at all. Like, if you go out, it rains. If it's not raining, there are midges biting you. Everyone's making tea all the time, and there's nearly the rosary, and people are bickering, and there's nothing left unsaid suddenly, So when it was over, I just thought, I never ever want to do that again, and I'm ashamed of myself for doing it in the first place, and it's a crime. And Irish families are awful, and Irish weather, and Catholicism is a complete way of just annoying novelists to have to read the rosary and things. And that's when I wrote the Henry James book. In other words, it's suddenly glamour. I could have duchesses. He could go to Florence and Venice. He could, So I decided I'd write that novel, and it was almost such a relief to have him going up the Grand Canal rather than someone going along a lane somewhere in County Wexford with sort of cowpats ahead of you, and all the flies, and anyway. So that in other words, sometimes you just need to get away from the unresolved pain of home.
Yeah,
basically.
It took you a long time, though, to write the Henry James book. You did a lot of...
Yeah, but I started it quickly. So that was, you make the decision to begin, and then you don't realize the years ahead. But I did the start of it quickly, just to get away from myself.
I don't quite believe that you won't write a third historical novel, just because of threes. I mean, 1 or 2, it's like bifocal.
Yeah, the word diptych is not one of the most beautiful words in the English language, is it? What are you working on? Oh, a diptych. A diptych.
But then there's the triptych.
I know, no, triptych, so it's not a triptych, a diptych.
We'd love to have some questions from the audience. Jen is going to be bringing a microphone around.
All right. Here you go.
If Michael publishes the diaries of his father, and I put the diaries in your book beside each other and go through it, how closely will your probabilities versus possibilities correspond?
Not much. For example, he's at the age of 75. Thomas Mann is in Switzerland, and he meets he meets a Bavarian waiter, and he really likes him. And his wife and daughter notice this, and they realize that he's being cheered up by the fact that he meets this waiter that he fancies, and they arrange for further meetings just to cheer him up a bit. In his diary, Thomas Mann writes, "I would exchange world fame for more time with this man." In a novel that won't work, it's too bold a statement, it's too extreme. I have to show it. I have to show him meeting the waiter. I have to involve him in slow time as these emotions come into him. I can't use the line from the diary. I can get inspiration from the line from the diary, but the line itself won't work for me. It's too graphic in a way. So I take a tone from the diaries, but and there's a moment where he remembers that he kissed this young man, and that kiss becomes important for me, that it's not more than a kiss. But it's not, I don't think there's any line for line. There would be very few examples of a line for line taken from the diaries into the novel. But I certainly took a tone from them.
I
I just want to tell a story that will, I think, bring a smile to your face. 3 years ago, I went to Dublin with my 13-year-old daughter. She's a champion Irish step dancer. And we were part of Dublin, and there was this used bookstore. So I go into the used bookstore, and I said, hey, I'm from upstate New York. Choose a book for me that is the definitive Irish book, Irish author. And he gave me Brooklyn. And I look down and I look at my daughter, Brooklyn. And he goes, I stand by my choice. I just thought you'd get a kick out of that.
It's very nice.
Oh, thank you very much. There's an episode towards the end of your book that I found totally fascinating, and it's the famous composer Schoenberg, who's part of the German exile community in Southern California, and he's out shopping, if I get the details right, and a woman comes up to him and says, "Do you have syphilis?" And now, Schoenberg is a rather pious fellow, at least that is presented there, and he's baffled by all of this. And then Alma Mahler, the widow of Gustav, explains to him, it seems, what happened, and also tells Thomas Mann, you libeled this man. We've got to do something about this. You put in Dr. Faustus Schoenberg as the model for the composer. And you said this composer was the inventor of the 12-tone scale. Everybody knows who that is. So I'm thinking about that. And Thomas Mann seems to say, well, hey, I'm a novelist. I have to have latitude. I can have a little liberty with my characters and the scenes and all. And I'm thinking, this is sort of like what you've done in your Thomas Mann book. Do you see a parallel there at all?
I do, yeah. I mean, the story is that Mann became interested in what culture meant, and especially the musical culture. In what element in it was poisonous? Was there an element in it that had actually made a pact with the devil, even metaphorically speaking? And of course, he was going to parties, and he was beginning to see Arnold Schoenberg in the flesh. And they never became friends, but they would often speak. And the friend they had in common was Alma Mahler, the widow of Gustav Mahler. And Mann became just watching Schoenberg. And in his novel, Dr. Faustus, there is, as you say, Adrian Leverkuhn has invented the 12-tone system, which Schoenberg did, or at least famously claimed that he did, and it certainly had. He was the main instigator of it worldwide, and he also had syphilis. And certainly a reader could easily feel this is based on Schoenberg. How much of it is based on Schoenberg? Is all of it a little bit? And every novelist has to work this out. What if you put your granny's, her funny hair in your novel, but you also had the granny being a murderer with, a poisoner? Would your granny not be able to say, hold on, everyone because of my hair thinks I'm also the poisoner? Like, what are you doing to me? And that's effectively what Schoenberg really, he wasn't reading anymore. His eyes were going. And so he got some of the Dr. Faustus. Unfortunately, Thomas Mann sent him a copy of the book saying for Arnold Schoenberg, I think the real one, or on some unfortunate phrase. But he didn't read the book. He got some of it put onto a dictaphone. And Alma Mahler looked after the rest. The bits that were offensive, he knew about. And it's the other way around. He's in the supermarket in Brentwood, and he meets a woman from the German community. And she's the one who tells the story that he said to her, I do not have syphilis in German. And she said, what are you talking about? And he explained, because this had fresh on his mind, and he thought everybody was looking at him. And she said, don't be so silly. And she went and told the Manns, and then Schoenberg decided this was serious, and he wrote a big article in the Saturday Evening Review pointing out the problem. And the problem also was that he hated a man called Adorno. And he blamed Adorno, quite rightly, for having given Thomas Mann all the technical information about 12-tone system. And there was another issue involved, which was Adorno was involved in Thomas Mann's book. And so he really went nuts for a while. And then he calmed down and he decided to make peace with Thomas Mann, but not with Adorno. And then something really stupid happened. He forced Thomas Mann to put a note at the back of his book, which you can still find in old copies. The figure of Adrian Leverkusen is not based on Arnold Schoenberg.
No.
And of course, this didn't help at all, because it made things actually worse. But so that's the story. And yes, it does raise huge issues about not as much using the dead in a book as using one aspect of someone, only one, and then claiming, but it isn't based on you, it just uses, some aspect of you. And someone say, well, no, everyone thinks it's all me. And actually in libel law, certainly in Ireland, libel law is if one characteristic is the same, the litigant can say that I have been libeled by some of the other characteristics that, even though they're not mine. So it's a very pressing point. Certainly, if you're writing a novel, it's a big one. So that's the story. Yeah.
All right, we'll just do 2 more questions.
This is a question about your decision to go to Columbia to teach, Colm. And I'm thinking of our mutual friend Jay Perini, who still loves teaching at Middlebury. I can understand that you have so much to offer as a teacher, reading your historical novels on Mann, but what do you get from the students? That would be if you're interested in describing that. What do you get when great writers like Jay Perini or yourself continue teaching?
I don't teach creative writing, so I'm in the English department, and I teach 1 semester a year, and just at the moment I'm teaching a seminar on Ulysses. And because of the way Columbia works with the core curriculum, the students know the Odyssey inside out. They know funny little names of funny little characters in the Odyssey. So the fact that Ulysses is based or loosely based on the Odyssey means that you're starting off with a group of undergraduates who, first of all, have that knowledge and also have knowledge that they expect books to be complex. They have no problem with changes of style in Ulysses. You tell them something once, you have to be careful, because you give them a gloss on some funny name in Arthur Griffith, and the next time Arthur Griffith comes, you don't even have to look at it. Everyone remembers who Arthur Griffith is. So it's a sort of pleasure. And also taking the book apart. On a Tuesday morning. When I wake up first, I live in dread of it. And now I lie there, why? Jay Perini can do it, but I'm not. Give it up. But then once I get up, I normalize a bit, and I get a lot from it. I get a lot of energy from it. It also sharpens me. It also means my reading becomes focused, and that's very useful. And I'm doing another one. I'm not going to go on about Henry James. So we're in the middle of The Wings of the Dove at the moment, and there's no downside for me at all in it. It's not a waste of time. It's a very important thing that writers still get to students. Yeah.
So I have just 2 really brief questions. One is, did they play Opus 133? And the second is, Lukács wrote an essay on Mann for his birthday, which Mann reports as somehow a sociologically and psychologically accurate portrayal. And I don't know, obviously I haven't read the book or the archive, if he's being nice to Lukács or if he sees Lukács having an insight about him. Thanks.
I can't really answer the second question, so I better not try. What was the first question? He listens to Opus. In his diaries, he notes that he's listening to Opus 132, and at one point, Michael in the string quartet plays Opus 132 for him. But I positioned it in a particular moment in 1942, that's fiction. But the fact that he was really connected to that particular quartet, and also that he saw his son playing in it, that's fact.
Colm Toibín, Lynne Tillman.
Thank you, darling. Thank you.